Protein.
Hemoglobin. So as hydrogen binds to hemoglobin, what happens to hemoglobin's binding affinity for oxygen?
Goes down.
It gets weaker. Right? So if you're looking at how hydrogen affects oxygen, Bohr effect. And in the tissues, it results in a right shift in the curve. So the Carbamino effect and the Bohr effect both result in a right shift in the curve as blood goes through these systemic capillaries. And a right shift means we have weakened the binding affinity between hemoglobin and oxygen, and that enhances dissociation and unloading. And then, of course, unloading oxygen actually helps facilitate the loading of CO2, Haldane effect. So you have Bohr effect, Carbamino effect, Haldane effect. Where are we now? There's CO2 loading, CO2 unloading, O2 loading. So where are we?
Pulmonary system, lungs.
Lungs. Blood's going through the pulmonary capillaries. PO2 is high now, right, relative to what it was in the tissues. It's like 104. Well, how does a high PO2 affect saturation? It increases it. Right? So we're on the plateau part of the curve. The higher the PO2, the higher the saturation. So that's the direct effect. Looking at how oxygen loading facilitates CO2 unloading, that's the Haldane effect. So as oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it weakens hemoglobin's binding affinity for CO2 to enhance CO2 unloading. At the same time, as CO2 leaves hemoglobin, it weakens hemoglobin's binding affinity for. It doesn't weaken it. What does it do? It strengthens it. I'll make sure someone's paying attention. I do realize you're going to have to chew on this at home, but try to stay with me best you can while I'm explaining it to you. So Haldane effect is how oxygen affects CO2. We are loading oxygen, we are unloading CO2. Oxygen binding to hemoglobin weakens the affinity for CO2, enhancing its removal. As CO2 leaves hemoglobin, it strengthens the binding affinity for oxygen. Right? Increase hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, which facilitates loading of oxygen. Carbamino effect. So how CO2 affects oxygen, Carbamino. How oxygen affects CO2 is Haldane. PCO2 in the lungs, low compared to the tissues. Right? PCO2 of 40 compared to 45. As CO2 goes down, hydrogen goes down. Right? Every time we remove the CO2 as we exhale, we force this reaction to the left, and we essentially remove a hydrogen. As hydrogen levels go down, does that create a right shift or a left shift?
Left shift.
A left shift. And that's because hydrogen leaving hemoglobin strengthens hemoglobin's binding affinity for oxygen to enhance O2 loading. So from the perspective of pH or hydrogen on the binding affinity for O2, that's the Bohr effect. Right? How CO2 affects the binding affinity for oxygen is Carbamino effect.
3 or 4 names.
Aren't you just loving this? I love physiology. This is the best part. You want to do some boring anatomy? It's okay, we have to do it. It's an A&P class. It's a requisite. So we can stop there. I see lots of eyes crossing.
Are we stopping?